for today's ICN Agency Effectiveness Working Group teleseminar on the use of screens and antitrust. I'm Rob Clark, economics professor at Queen's University in Canada, and I'll be the moderator for the seminar. A few housekeeping points just before we begin. First, a reminder to mute your mics. There will be an opportunity at the end to unmute during our question and answer period. So you can use the raise hand feature should you have any questions. Alternatively, you can put your questions in the chat and then I can ask your question for you. One disclaimer, the meeting is being recorded and the meeting will be posted online. Okay, Shabnam, can you go to the next slide, please? So the objective of this panel is to provide an economic perspective on the use of screens for cartel detection. The panelists will each share their experiences in recent investigations involving screens and detecting collusion. And examples will be drawn from actual cartel cases. Next slide, please. So just to get everyone on the same page and as a point of context, I thought I'd start with a quick definition. What we mean by screens, proactive statistical tools used to identify markets and or firms suspected of collusive behavior. And I don't want to get too deep into it because our panelists are going to do just that. But let me say that there are two broad types of screens. Structural screens, via which identification is based on industry characteristics that facilitate collusion, and behavioral screens where identification is based on behavior associated with collusion or alternatively competition. And the purpose of these screens is to uncover prosecutorial cases of collusion, and screens can be used instead of or in conjunction with reactive methods for uncovering cartels. And so by reactive methods, I mean amnesty programs or leniency programs. And the application of screens involves a number of challenges, but if data are of sufficiently high quality, then it's possible that screens can act as a useful tool to provide a red flag for collusive behavior. Next slide. And so to provide more details on all of this, we have three expert panelists joining us today. Each will speak for 15 minutes as soon as I'm done with the introduction here. So Robin Noble will lead us off. He's a partner at Auxerra Consulting in the UK. He's a specialist in digital issues, in competition economics, and in quantifying damages, lots of experiences in competition disputes. And he'll be talking to us about some of those matters today. Jens Roth Kotima is a data science specialist at the Danish Competition and Consumer Authority. He's a specialist in computational collusion and cartel detection. And he's developed a tool to screen for, test for bid rigging, and he'll tell us a little bit about that screen today. And finally, Ricardo Medeiros de Castro is the chief economist adjunct at the Brazilian Administrative Council for Economic Defense. He's a specialist in antitrust and international law, and he'll tell us about some of the experiences they've had in Brazil with using screens. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Robin, who's going to talk to us for the next 15 minutes. All right, take it away, Robin.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And as that kind introduction said, my name's Robin Noble. I'm a partner at the economic consulting firm Auxerra. The Ox comes from Oxford, which is where I'm sat today in our office here. But we have worked in cases all over Europe, focusing on cartels, and in some of those we've deployed some of the tools and the techniques that I'm going to talk to you about today. And so when I first started being a professional economist, I was driven, and that was about 20 years ago, I was driven very much by the fact that I felt that economics had a lot of answers to give. And when I first started out, actually, I didn't realize that actually we economists could also, in a sense, act as detectives. But that is, in a sense, one of the things that these screens allow us to do. So let me first of all sort of build on that introduction by jumping on to the next slide and explaining a little bit more about what screens are, how do they work, and how one might try and deploy them, either as an agency or as a firm or a private practitioner in the market. And as we heard in our introduction, there are sort of two broad categories you can put these into. The first is market structure-based screens, and the second is about behavior, so pricing and bidding behavior screens. So let's start with the first. So market structure-based screens. This is intimately linked with the economic theory and evidence on cartel formation and stability. So a lot of what the screens are trying to do is essentially operationalize what it is that either case law or economic textbooks have told us about, essentially makes cartels more likely to be successful. So I'll give you a few examples. One is, for example, that you might expect to have a more higher likelihood or greater success for cartels when there are fewer firms and or when the market's very concentrated. Obviously, it's much, much harder to have a successful collusive set of behaviors in a market with very, very large numbers of players and or very, very disparate amounts of market share held by each of them. Similarly, when you talk about product differentiation, it's much easier to achieve coordination when you have something that's more homogeneous than it is when something is highly differentiated. Because if you think about what economics tells us about that in a highly differentiated set of products, essentially each product, each firm, they have their own demand and they have their own upwardly sloping demand curve, and it is less contingent on the behavior and pricing of their rivals. And there are very practical examples of this. There's a very famous quote from Richard Wish, which is directed at most competition authorities, which is to say, go and find the cement cartel because it's there. You just haven't found it yet. And of course, that is built firmly on this insight, which is that the more homogeneous a product, the more likely it is that there is going to be a cartel in there. And there are many more. I'll just give you a couple more. Entry and exit barriers. The bigger they are, the more protected an industry feels, and therefore, in a sense, the easier it is to start collusion and the easier it is to sustain collusion. Similarly with demand stability. So there are many, many factors here that you can take into account. But often when people are talking about screens, or at least in the more recent sense, they are not just talking about these structural screens. They are talking about these behavioral techniques. And in fact, a lot of what we're going to hear throughout the rest of the presentations are focused on these latter type, about what people are actually doing within that relevant, within that market. And there are lots of different ways of doing that. And this slide does not do justice to all of them, but it does give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the things that you can do. So for example, perhaps the simplest is you simply look for high prices. In a sense, that is when we talk about damages quantification, if you're acting for a claimant in a cartel case, you are trying to measure by how much too high are the prices. And of course, you can do that by looking across markets, at a benchmark product that you don't think is affected by collusion, or you can do it across time where you might see prices going up for an unexplained reason. Another measure you can use is stable prices. So for example, you might expect that one particular way the cartel might operate is that because communication is costly, it might be easier for firms to simply keep prices the same. Any movement or deviation from that might be incorrectly interpreted as some sort of violation of the cartel agreement. And so there is at least some evidence in some markets that when variance goes down, that may be a signal that there is something going on with the pricing. There's communication going on that perhaps there shouldn't be. Similarly, you might expect to see in some markets differences in the price rises. You can measure this through skewness, and the rationalization of this is that some cartels may well have a preference for positive price changes, because negative price changes might be misinterpreted as cheating, essentially people deviating from the agreement. And if there's deviation, then you can often trigger retaliatory action from others. And so that can lead in certain circumstances to either no price rises or a bias towards positive price rises. Another potential measure of this is what's sometimes called zero large but not medium price changes, and that's something you'd measure by something called kurtosis. And that's essentially, it's a similar sort of logic to the last one in the sense that it is focusing more though on the idea that there are costs associated with engaging in price changes. And so the default is that you don't make a change. And when you make a change, you make quite a large change because in a sense, it's a bit like a menu costs argument. It's an argument that says that when colluders are working together, they have to expend substantially more energy to make any change at all relative to the competitive equilibrium where everyone makes their decision on their own. Another technique is where you start to look at unusual distributions, and there are a whole host of techniques out there that you can do that with. You can look at the likelihood that numbers end with particular figures. You can look at unusual patterns and changes in those. And there are in fact many famous examples where people have done various of these techniques: the LIBOR market, US highway bidding, school milk, Swiss construction contracts. There's a final slide in this deck which I won't talk through, but there's a number of very famous references in there which give you some practical examples of this being applied both in the academic literature and more professionally. But that's a very quick run through of the literature itself. And if you're particularly interested in following up on that, there's a couple of references in that reading list that I'd point you towards. Perhaps the first and the second stops would be the OECD paper on this topic. It has some really very high quality discussion in its summary. And the second is a book written by some colleagues of mine, Gunnar Niels and Helen Jenkins, which has a very interesting and amusing chapter that speaks about this. So if we jump onto the next slide. So we've had a very quick canter through some of the theory that lies behind this, but there are many real world applications, and we're going to hear quite a bit more from the next two speakers about some of those. So I won't dwell on the first point because they're coming from the competition authority perspective. But there are many examples of competition authorities either using them now or having used and explored screens in the past. DG Comp, for example, in Brussels has explored these kinds of techniques in the recent past to see whether or not it can essentially rely a bit less on the leniency program and a bit more on proactive agency-led investigations. The UK CMA here in the UK has had a program where it's actually had some publicly available tools that it's made available to businesses to see whether or not they can self-detect whether there might be a collusion, particularly focused on, for example, public authorities, so that they can do bid screening and so on, and similar work being going on in Switzerland. One very interesting trend I have noticed as well is that companies in the market have also been very much on the front foot. So, for example, Deutsche Bahn has had a program of claiming damages from a large number of its suppliers over the last decade. It was one of the first European corporate businesses to really take advantage of the changes that have happened in European law and also the Commission guidelines on antitrust damages. It's brought a very large number of claims, for example, on rail tracks, on steel, on concrete, for example. But it's gone one step further. So it's not just claiming for cartels that have been found by authorities, it's also trying to root them out itself. And there's an item included on the list on the next slide, which is a paper by two individuals at Deutsche Bahn, which describes some of the work that they have been doing, trying to evaluate their own bids using their own proprietary tools and software and techniques. And in my professional world, I can't name them, but I have also seen other corporate businesses exploring exactly this. And it is in part driven by the rise of antitrust damages in the last 10 to 15 years. Certainly in Europe, this wasn't such a feature as it was perhaps in North America. So we may well see a little bit more of that going forward. And then very finally, the other point to highlight here is the use of these tools and techniques in courtrooms. There are some famous cases in Europe, for example, the wood pulp case, where the European Commission relied heavily on economic evidence to try and demonstrate that there was a cartel in wood pulp. That was overturned in the courts. But perhaps the tide has turned a little bit in the recent past, because there's been some very interesting activity in courts more recently. One particular case to draw your attention to is the maritime car carriers case, and that involved Daimler, so the company that owns the Mercedes-Benz mark. They were suing a number of maritime car carriers. So these are sort of roll-on, roll-off ferries that carry Daimler vehicles, often from Germany throughout the world for delivery to their customers. There was a cartel found by the European Commission and by some other international authorities in that particular instance. But Daimler's case was that this infringement was bigger and longer lasting than was found by lots of these authorities. And one reason for that was that there were a number of international agreements that were signed by, for example, the European Union with third countries that essentially limited the scope of competition law. And so that it meant it wasn't possible for the European Commission to have found an infringement for earlier years. And it was Daimler's case that there was an infringement for earlier years, and it was going to go out and prove it. And of course, it didn't have the luxury of necessarily having all the work done for it by authorities, so it had essentially to take that work on itself. Now, ultimately, this case settled, but there are some interesting judgments in the public domain. I've got one of them on my reading list, which do discuss at a relatively high level the role and the merits and demerits of the economic evidence. And overall, they seem to land rather positively in that the courts did in fact see a role for this, particularly in this sort of circumstance when you're talking about something where a competition authority hasn't necessarily done the work, perhaps for good reason, but also now the company wants to do it itself. But it's often, you're talking about a very long time ago, so you may not have the luxury of a full suite of documents to prove your case, and so you may have to augment them with additional evidence, in this case economic analysis of pricing and bidding behavior. And of course that leads to this final point on this slide, which is that in all of these instances, whether you're Deutsche Bahn, whether you're Daimler, whether you're DG Comp, ultimately you are facing a question of, well, maybe you see something interesting in a market structure. Maybe you see something interesting with pricing or bidding behavior. How far does that get you? Is that enough in and of its own right to demonstrate that there is an infringement? Well, it might be in a situation where there's no other plausible explanation. But in my experience, there often are other plausible explanations for what's going on. And so often what one commonly sees is that you have to ally economic statistical evidence on the one hand with other types of evidence, perhaps from dawn raids, perhaps from disclosure on the other. And it's when you bring those two things together, that's when you have the most powerful set of evidence from this. So on that, I will end, and I will hand back to our next presenter.
Great, thank you very much, Robin. That was excellent. Jens, you ready?
I am. Thank you very much. I'm waiting for my slides to appear. Great. Thank you very much. So my name is Jens Kultima. I'm a data science specialist at the Danish Consumer Competition and Consumer Authority. Over the last 3 years, I've been both developing and coordinating an international effort to co-develop a tool called BidViewer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that tool today, and I will also mention some of the challenges that we are facing, and some of them have already been shared. So you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just a very quick, brief overview. Why are we spending efforts in trying to develop these screens and use them? Cartels increases prices. There are some different statistics. Some numbers say about 20% on average, and some say 50 to 100%, and it obviously varies a lot between different sectors. But that they do increase prices is the case. And in Denmark, at least, they are illegal, and they're also operating over many years. So there is an incentive on our part as a competition authority to identify these cartels and also collusion. And the focus of my talk today will be public procurement, which represents 14% of Denmark's GDP and 24% of the public spending. So it's a significant amount of money, so it's worthwhile looking into this. And as has been already mentioned a couple of times, we have these two different types of screens. I'll be focusing on the behavioral screens here, and I've had the pleasure of having much of the information already introduced. So I will just briefly touch on it. Behavioral screens, the way I work with them personally at the authority is that the idea is that they would flag suspicious firms and tenders. And here, I really want to stress that the way we, at least here in Denmark, work with this is that it's only the first indication of that there may be something suspicious. So because a firm or a tender is flagged in a specific screen is by far not enough. And that was mentioned by Robert. And the idea is then to enable further targeted investigations based on these raised flags. It's a way for us as an agency to conserve resources because we can target specific firms or specific tenders or specific markets. And we can also use it as a means to identify otherwise undetectable collusion. And as already mentioned, it requires reliable and high quality data, and that's really one of the challenges that we have. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So the tool that we developed, BidViewer, it's developed here in Denmark. It's also an international collaboration between a number of authorities around the world, and there will be a publication coming out within the next month. And I'll mention some parts of this tool today, and I'll focus on the ones about statistical indicators based on the behavioral screens and machine learning, and then a couple of market sharing detection methods. So it was already mentioned, the coefficient of variation and the skewness. And an additional one that I can talk about here is the normalized relative distance. So on the left-hand side, we see 5 red dots. Think of these as the bids in a tender. So each column here represents a tender, so there would be 5 tenders. And then within each of these tenders, there would be a number of bids. On the left-hand side to the very far left, the lowest bid would be at the bottom. And then there's a little bit of a larger gap until you have the second, third, fourth, and fifth bid. And the idea here would be that if firms collude, they would coordinate such that there is a larger gap between the first and the second bid. That's an example of how one of these screens may work. And then as mentioned as well, the coefficient of variation, the idea that there would be less variation between the bids in some cases where there have been a cartel. And then as well, the skewness can be affected in other situations. So next slide, please. Thank you. So what we do, in addition to using these statistical indicators, is that they can be combined into a machine learning model. And here there are many different ways of doing that. One example of how to do it is you take a public data set. I've actually personally used some of the ones that were already mentioned. You train a model by looking at or generating these different statistical indicators for each of the tenders, and then you know when there's a collusion or not because it's a labeled data set. So you train a model on that, and then you can test it on another data set. You can also test it on a subset of the data, but it's also possible to test it on a completely new data set. So that would require at least 2 publicly available data sets. And one interesting problem then that arises is how consistent are cartel behaviors across country, across types of categories of tenders, the types of products, and also over time, for example, do they change their behavior over time? So there's a lot of things to unpack there. Once you have generated the model, you've tested it on another public data set, and you are somewhat confident in the model, you can then apply it to a local national data set. And that's what we see in the next slide. On the left-hand side, these 2 are both histograms. So on the left-hand side, we see number of tenders that receive a score from 0 to 1, depending on how likely is it that this particular tender has been part of collusion. On the left-hand side, it's labeled public data, so we know where there was collusion and where there wasn't. So the ones that are red, the red bars represents tenders with known collusion. And in this case, they are the tenders that receive the highest score. And that means our model works rather well. There are still some false positives. So there is a trade-off between false negatives and false positives to be done here. And then on the right-hand side, I have applied that model to a Danish national data set, where we again see that there's a number of tenders to the left, and then there's a few tenders to the right with rather high scores. And those tenders would then be the ones that are relevant to look at and investigate further. And again, these would be flags, and we would then use other methods to identify whether there's something more suspicious with the bidding of these tenders, or whether, again, there can be another plausible explanation. So my job as a data scientist is really to approach this very openly and thinking, okay, this, according to my model, says it's a suspicious bidding pattern. What other plausible explanations do I have? And then we can use all types of information that's both in the data set and publicly available, for example, to look at these patterns. And can I have the next slide? Thank you. So I've so far talked about first the statistical indicators, and then we talked about combination of statistical indicators into machine learning models. A third way of doing this is to use other types of analysis. And here there's, for example, a network analysis where each of the larger dots, gray, blue, and red, represents companies. The smaller, slightly larger, darker dots are tenders. And the lines between a tender and a company indicates that this particular company participated in this particular tender. What I've highlighted here with the blue and red large ellipses are the tenders that 2 companies participate in. So I know, for example, that this is a specific market. I know that these 2 companies are the largest players on that market. And this particular visualization for me shows which tenders do they participate in. And what this figure tells me is that the blue company and the red company never participate in the same tender. So that's an example of a visualization and a methodology to understand how do these companies bid. And of course, there may be a very natural explanation for this, why they don't participate in the same tenders. But it is a starting point for us as an authority to look into and understand, okay, largest players in this market, are there other explanations why they don't compete with one another? Or have they, in this case, potentially decided to share split up products? Can I have the next slide? Another way of dividing a market is, for example, if two companies decide to not win in different regions. So they would submit bids in tenders all over Denmark, but they have already decided who will win different regions of Denmark. So this tool can also use methods to identify such regional market sharing, for example. And can I have the next slide? Thank you. So those were some very quick slides and thoughts on these screens, how we can combine these statistical indicators into models, and we can also use other types of approaches to have as a starting point. And as was already alluded to, there are really a lot of challenges, and I just want to, in the next few minutes, briefly skim over some of those challenges, because I think they are very relevant as an authority to be aware of and to look at. Obviously, high quality, reliable data is very important. Screens, high quality screens that perform well are very important to be able to do relevant investigations. And then also collaborations between national authorities, for example, but also internationally as well. And then when we have good data, we can develop good screens, we can do good investigations, which means we can show other authorities what is it that works. And then we can use that to further get access to more data. And then this is a positive spiral upwards. Can I have the next slide, please? So just with data, being a data scientist, I really care strongly about having good quality data. And one of the things that is really important as an authority to think about is to have access to all bids, both losing bids and winning bids, canceled bids, invalid bids. Also understanding what type of procurement procedure is this, what category of product is it, do we have temporal data, so over many years, where is the geography located, how specific is the geography information, and what information do we have on the different firms that participate. And here it's really useful in my experience to have close collaborations with other agencies within the government, also potentially with procurement portals, because they often host a lot of the data. And then as a last resort, it's also possible to web scrape publicly available data. And of course, it's also important to think about how can we receive this data. Shall we download it or get it delivered to us? Next slide, please. One of the challenges with screens is, again, access to data, but also know-how in terms of a person developing a screen should preferably be at least a programmer, an economist, and an investigator, because there's really an overlap between all these different fields. So how do we find a person with that experience, or how do we combine that experience in our authority? And then translating the theory into code is not always as easy. It might be easy to have an idea of how these companies might collude, but then translating that into an actual screen might be very difficult. And again, how do we validate this across sector and country and time? And then eventually applying these screens to our local data, which might be limited. And I think I'm actually out of time. So I'm going to stop with those challenges, and then if there's time at the end, we might have a discussion on other challenges.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Jens. Ricardo, we'll get your slides up here.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you. My name is Guilherme de Castro. It's a great honor to be here to talk to you about cartel screening tools. And if we can go to the next slide, I may present CAG to you. CAG is an institution responsible for protection of competition process, not protection of a specific enterprise or a specific company, but to protect the competitive environment. CAG is formed by a tribunal that judges the cases, by general superintendents that brings this case to the tribunal, by federal attorneys that represent CAG in Brazilian judiciary system, and the Department of Economic Studies, which I am part of, and we help all these units and even administrative ones. And of course, we do have our own agenda of advocacy efforts and studies. If we go to the next slide, we can see some working papers and studies that not only CAG, but our partners, there's CEPRAC and IPEA, we did on this matter. We have also more than 6 hours of conversations with experts about methods for identifying cartels. I'm sorry, part of these materials in Portuguese, but we can translate further on part of this material, but I give you the links to access them all. If we go to the next slide, we can also see that CAG has 2 units responsible for handling cartel screening tools. The first one is located in General Superintendents and is responsible for BRAIN project. This BRAIN project unit was created in 2013 with the focus on public procurement cases, and it used machine learning algorithms to detect patterns that could be used as collusive markers. And I will talk further on about Operation Meeting Point. It's an important operation that started with the help of this unit. And in the Department of Economic Studies, we also help BRAIN project unit. We use econometrics and machine learning to do so. And I'll talk about my experience in liquid fuel market and the use of cartel screening tools in this market. Please go to the next slide. Here, I explained that, well, we have several papers about cartel screening tools, and this specific paper about Ragazzo-Silva test is an important one. It was used in more than 100 cases here in Brazil, and the main goal about this test is to see if there is a negative linear correlation between profit margins and price variation. I give you an example of this case here, a case that occurred in João Pessoa, a city of Brazil, when the variation of the prices went almost to zero. The prices were very similar, and we can see that the profit margin increased a lot, and this is a cartel that was discovered by the use of this test. If we go to the next slide, we can see, of course, we do have other tests. For example, Panzer-Rose test is a test that aims to measure Aewg statistic. Aewg statistic is the sum of equilibrium gross revenue elasticities with respect to input price. Depending on the value of Aewg statistic, you may have a perfectly competitive scenario or a collusive one. If we go to the next slide, we can also see another kind of test that tries to measure conduct parameter. Conduct parameter is a manner of nesting 3 models of first order conditions on how companies, they maximize their profits. And of course, depending on the value of lambda, you may have competitive scenario or a collusive scenario. If we go to the next slide, we can see that Bresnan and Lau try to suggest a way that we could measure this lambda. For example, here, if we rotate the demand curve by interacting the demand curve with an instrument, we may find a competitive scenario if the price doesn't change with the rotation of the demand curve. However, and it's on the 5 other slides here, we can see that if price do change with the change, this rotation of the demand curve, you may find companies with market power And depending on the level of market power, you may have a collusive scenario. I'm sorry, the points are not very, in my slides, they were in another format here, but you can see the equilibrium here. If we go to the next slide, we have to make a very quick disclaimer that some private parties try to use these sort of screening tools to try to invalidate direct evidence of cartel, but that's not the purpose of this kind of screening tools. Cartel is a conduct prohibited per se, independently if the enterprise are maximizing their profits. So even the invitation of cartel is an illicit conduct. And I don't think these kind of models could be used to invalidate direct evidence of cartel. If we go to the next slide, we can talk about this practical case that I told you before, meeting point case. This case was discovered by the administrative staff of COG that tried to hire some personnel to secure COG's building. And they discovered that some competitors were sharing the same email and had the same shareholders. These this fact was reported to Brain Project Unit, and Brain Project Unit used certain cartel screening tools and crossed some database and discovered that there was a much wider cartel in this specific market. Some companies were sharing the same IP number, the same computer to present proposals in public biddings. For example, in public procurement cases, Defox and Imperial, they share the same IP 1,099 times here. And of course, they use other kind of instruments, other kind of screening. One of them was Benford law. According to Benford law, in a multi-digit natural number distribution, you have expected values that you are expected to see, but the proposals didn't follow these expected numbers. The case is still pending, but we acquired a lot of qualitative evidence through down rates that were obtained because the Brain Project Unit could make these could handle these tools very well. If we go to the next slide, and I will here talk about my own experience in using cartel screening tools in liquid fuel market. I was called to present an opinion in 2018. And before 2018, what I saw is that the Department of Economic Studies used only Ragazzo-Silva test, the test that I told you before, in an univariated analysis focusing on asymptotic qualities of such inference, inferring that this inference is a linear relationship. And the Department of Economic Studies only use 5% of database that we have here because they only look to pre-selected cities. Pre-selected cities that they run regressions by the request of the police or general superintendents, and they excluded outliers. And nowadays, we don't use only Ragazzo-Silva test, we use a basket of several screening methods, and we changed Ragazzo-Silva test. For instance, we are now using multivariate analysis with multiple screening tools. And sometimes we are more, we tend to be more flexible about Markov Gaussian assumptions, about linearity of this relationship between profit margins and price variation. We run regressions for all the cities that we are that we have here, and in ANP's database, we do that automatically and periodically, and we use sometimes outliers as important information. If we go to the next slide, we also can see that we have several empirical papers about this market, but I didn't hear much about the size of bias of ANP's database. ANP is the regulatory agency of the sector. This database that is used by COG and by several empirical papers cover less than 10% of Brazilian cities, and has a huge bias. Indeed, in this very short amount of data, we see lack of randomness. Sometimes in some cities, only 30% of liquid fuel market is surveyed without randomness. And if we go to the next slide, we can see why this is so particularly important. For example, in Rio de Janeiro, there is a part of Rio de Janeiro that has high prices and another part with low prices. Depending on how you design the sample, you may have a specific price variation or a specific price means. If we look to the other slide in São Paulo, we can see the same kind of phenomenon. For example, here, if you go one slide more, we can see that in the center of São Paulo, there is higher price, but in the other parts of São Paulo, you have cheaper prices. If we go to the next slide, we can see that sometimes negative correlation, that is the whole purpose of Ragazzo-Silva tests, is caused by this kind of bias. In this example, in Abaetetuba case, we can see that ANP didn't collect some information about the cheapest gas station of the region, and that caused the negative correlation between price margins and price variation. If you go to the next slide, we can see here the main idea, the core, the heart of the Ragazzo-Silva test. Ragazzo-Silva test wants to see if you have a focal point, if you have a cartel when you have higher profits and low price variation, a lower price variation. If we go to the next slide, however, there are some situations where you may not find, if you plot profit in one axis and price variation in the other axis, and please go to the next slide, okay, one more time. Sometimes you may have reasons for not having a linear assumption. Please go back. And before 2018, the Department of Economic Studies discarded this relationship if we do not have normally distributed residuals. We try to resample the data if the data doesn't fit the model, but we are now worried that to create other models that could also deal with other kinds of relationships and not only linear ones. If we go to the other slide, nowadays we are trying, for example, to make some regressions and see if the residuals are disproportionately higher in some cities than in others. And if we go to the next slide, we also are trying to see if there is a break in structurally break in time series. And of course, I could talk a little more about some of these issues, but in the other slide, I will just give you the main message of my presentations, that we are using other screening tools and in a basket, and we are working with the regulatory agents of this sector to obtain better quality data. And this is a continuous process. Go to the next slide, please. And thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. Thank you to all three panelists. That was really great. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else on the call did too. So let's open it up to questions. And I think there's two ways that people can ask questions. You can either raise your hand, and I'll try to notice you and let you ask your question, or you can type it into the chat, and then I can ask the question on your behalf. And I guess probably the best way is to, if your question is directed at one of our three panelists in particular, maybe you can say so that they know who should jump in. Okay, so I have a few questions, but I'll give it a second here to see if people have questions. If not, I'll lead us off. Let me check our chat here. Okay, well, let me start with one, and then that'll give people a chance. This is sort of for everybody. When I think about screens, one of the main concerns I have about them is the extent to which firms might start to react or to adapt to the screens that are in place. And so, I mean, this is maybe imposing a little bit too much rationality or a little bit too much sophistication on firms, but if firms are aware that antitrust authorities, or as Robin mentioned, possibly firms are using these screens, should we expect that they will adapt to them? And if they are going to be adapting to them, can we design tests that can deal with that feature? Robin, maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I mean, I think yes and no in terms of that being a concern. Yes, I think it is a concern. And in fact, that's why I can't mention some of the firms that are using some of these, because it is their explicit intention that people don't know that that's what they're doing. But having said that, I think we heard one very good example, in the presentation from Kaje about the fact that even if you are bidding with the competition authority, you might still exhibit suspicious behavior. So you may be imposing too much of a constraint of rationality and awareness of these kind of techniques.
Good. Jens, did you have something to add?
I will say what Robin said, yes and no. On my perspective, I think we have to continue developing methods. I think it would be unwise to just say, okay, they might learn something, therefore we shouldn't even try. And then there's a balance between how much do we as a competition authority and a public body talk about our methods. And then I think there will be national differences. So for example, here in Denmark, we're choosing a more open approach where we're talking about some of the methods we're doing as a way of indicating that, hey, this is something that we are focusing on. And other countries may choose a different path. And another way of thinking about it is that, a good screen that designs to be screened in a specific way might shift companies' behavior such that, the only behavior that's left for them is a competitive behavior. That would obviously be a great outcome for methods.
Well, and I do agree with Robin and Jens, and companies can learn on what we are doing, on what we are looking at, but of course we must continue to develop and improve our screening tools, and maybe to collect this evidence in some other way they do not expect, or to learn more about the market. I think it's a process that you are learning and you are investigating. I like it very much, the way that Robin proposed this as economists as detectives. And I think this is part of a detective role.
Very good. Okay. I don't see any other questions coming yet, so that's fine. I get to ask more of my questions.
Well, actually, just
yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Just to actually build on the point that Jens made, it's actually worth really emphasizing the latter point that he made, because in a sense, your question is almost a version of Goodhart's law, which is where you say, well, as soon as you start measuring something, it stops being a good indicator of the thing that you're trying to measure. Whereas I think actually Jens' answer is very powerful, because unlike in, say, for example, macroeconomics, where the idea of Goodhart's law comes from, where you say, well, let's measure M4 as a measure of, of the money supply, and then it suddenly stops being a good measure of the money supply. Here, as Jens said, it actually, if you can make these screens good enough, actually they themselves can act as disruptors to cartels. It's not just the fear of being caught. It's the fact that by trying to not be caught, you actually make your cartel less effective. And so in a sense, it's almost the Goodhart's law in reverse, that actually by making this a not good measure anymore, it may have fulfilled its purpose anyway.
I agree. Yeah, great point. Okay, we have a question in the chat here for Jens. Congratulations for your work and presentation. I'd like to know a little bit more about the publication you mentioned that you organize with other competition authorities. Will the publication present descriptions about screening techniques, models, methodologies, or focus on strategies to implement screening projects?
Excellent question. Thank you very much. The publication will be available on our authority's website in the next month. It will be explaining the tool that we have developed in relatively broad outline. So in that sense, it's a description to some extent of how we're approaching it. It won't be an exact formula for others to replicate. However, we do invite other national competition agencies to collaborate with us. So we're hoping to continue international collaboration in that sense.
Great. Maybe one more general question. It kind of follows on what we were just talking about, but at one point, Jens, you were talking about false positives and false negatives. And maybe for the three of you, if anyone wants to take this, how should we think about that trade-off here? It seems to be a kind of important one when thinking about the use of screens. So I don't know if any of you have some comments on that.
I can start off. I mean, one very basic approach is if you have a few different methods that gives a score between 0 and 1 of how likely is it that this firm or tender is part of collusion, you start at the top of your pile and then you work your way down the pile. And then as you do that, you learn things. And then, of course, it would eventually be good to pick something in the middle of the pile to have something to compare with. But, you know, there's definitely in how much resources and how much time and manpower do we have and where do we start?
Very good. Ricardo, Robin, I don't know if you had anything to add to that. If not, there is one other question in the chat that I'll go to here. Okay, so here's the question. In lieu of high quality and reliable data, what empirical screens have been most useful based on your experience? Does anyone want to take that?
I can say a few words on that, which is that I think with the less data you have, I think the more you practically have to rely on structural screens rather than data and bidding screens. You know, in a sense, a lot of what we've talked about here has been in the latter category, but I think as Jens and Ricardo both rightly highlighted, you know, you've seen beautiful charts, you've seen, you know, animated diagrams and so on. That you need the dots on those charts and on those maps, and those are the data. And obviously, the better quality data that you have, the better these are going to work. And in fact, one other point that's really worth emphasizing, which hit home with me, was the point that Jens made, which was around the fact that it's not just the actual bids that were accepted or the ones that you actually, you know, awarded the tender on. It's all those earlier stages. You know, who didn't bid, who had a spoiled bid or an invalid bid. Now, and in fact, some of those are very practical challenges in terms of engaging, you know, with a public authority or with a business to get the, you know, relevant data holders to actually even collate that. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges I think I've personally faced. Is it's often much easier to get good data on, well, the winner and what price they paid. Next is, well, who else bid? Sometimes that's lost already. To go further and then find out all these other things about who was asked and didn't. You know, the further back in time you go, the more difficult that becomes. So yes, it's you know, data is definitely the absolute requirement here, and the more of it, the more you can do.
I agree. Yes, Jens, a follow up there.
Yeah, I think you know, what the question is, which is the best screen, and it comes down to some screens are developed to identify companies, for example, So there are some network approaches where you identify which companies bid together. But if you have a market where you know there's only 5 companies in this market, that screen is not going to be particularly useful. But if you have a market where there's thousands of companies and you're like, where do I start? That screen might be useful. So that's an example of a screen that is dependent on your market structure very much.
Well, and I don't think you have much substitute if you do not have high quality data. You must have to search for high quality data. And but answering your later question about positive or false positive or false negatives, I saw one paper that an author was using machine learning algorithm to try to detect. He was labeling some cartels and expected that the algorithm do the rest, do the work. But according to the algorithm that understood that if you have low price, you have a cartel, and that just doesn't make any sense. You have to look what the algorithm is telling you and to look what data are telling you and to see if there is plausibility. And of course, when you are using machine learning tools, it's sometimes a little more difficult to do that. But I think that's the effort, that's the challenge that we have here.
Good stuff. Okay, we're starting to go over time here, but we have a couple more questions. I know Jens may need to hop off at some point, but I'm happy to stay on and work through these questions if people have time. So here's the next one. One more question. It says, it's hard to translate techniques to code, but I would like to know about your efforts to translate the results to decision makers, usually non-specialists in data science. Did you use data-vis techniques?
I can answer that. So that is definitely something that we are very, very engaged with. It's like, how do we communicate something effectively to both lawyers and data scientists, economists, investigators, and judges? So it's about finding, for example, ways of visualizing something. So I showed this map of Denmark. I could show that with a histogram with the different labels of the country region names, but that wouldn't be useful. But in this case, when you put it on a map, it's very obvious that there's a split. So short answer is yes, it's very much a focus on us, on our part.
Good. Yeah, I agree. Okay, next one. Price comparison is possible within a tender, but very difficult if you want to compare prices between different tenders. Have you found some working ideas on how to compare prices between different tenders?
I can answer that very briefly. Our perspective, some of the indicators that we develop or the statistical indicators that have been mentioned, the skewness and the normalized relative difference and kurtosis take care of part of that problem. And then there are also other methods where you can normalize everything between 0 and 1, or you can also just use the raw bids for neural networks, for example.
Yeah, I think sometimes if you have like engineer estimates, you can normalize relative to that. That's helpful too in that context. All right. Any other questions coming online here? I was going to ask one for you, Jens. You talked about this measure of normalized relative distance and this bigger gap between the lowest and second lowest bid relative to the others. I've done some work along the same lines. I'm wondering what your thoughts are as in terms of the factors that explain that bigger gap there. Why do you think of that as an indicator of bid rigging?
My personal opinion is the extent is that companies might use that as a measure to ensure that the lowest bid actually wins. Because if there is a quality score in play, for example, it gets more tricky for them. So that would be my personal opinion on that. And perhaps there's other additional thoughts out there.
Okay, very good. All right, I don't see anything else in the chat. I don't see any more hands raised, and so I think I'll bring this to a close. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists again. I thought this was great. I learned a lot, and hope that everyone in the audience did as well. So I know it's always hard when we're doing these things virtually, but a round of applause for our panelists. And thank you to our organizers for putting this on. That was great. Thank you very much. Okay.
Ryan, thank you to you, Robert.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and ciao.
Bye-bye, everyone.